This tutorial will cover how to create a language experiment in Psychopy using Psychopy's builder, also known as Psychopy's GUI or graphical user interface. I'll start by giving a brief introduction to how Psychopy's builder works, and then I'll move on to specific features of Psychopy that one might want to use in order to create an experiment. The Psychopy builder's default view is three main panels. 1, 2, 3. The first is routines in the top left. It's the largest panel. The second is flow, that's at the bottom. And the third is components, which is in the top right. The really big panel at the top left shows your experiment's routines. And routines are just things or components that happen in your experiment that need to be presented in a certain order or repeated. So for example, the default routine that's loaded is a trial, which you can see in the flow panel, right there. That is half a second ISI. Half a second ISI. So this particular routine is just an interstimulus interval of 0.5 seconds. So I'll delete this routine so that we can build our experiment from scratch. Delete. And then we can add or insert the routine that we want. We'll put new. And I'm going to call this routine exposure. So routines are made up of one or more components which determine what kind of stimulus will occur or what kind of response will be recorded. So for example, in our language experiments, a frequent type of stimuli is an exposure stream or an audio sound. So we can add an audio stimulus by clicking on the audio stimulus. And I'll change the name to exposure sound. And then I'll set the duration to infinite by making the stop box blank. So notice that if you hold your mouse over any of the boxes, you'll get a brief description of what goes there, kind of like a hint. I'm just going to show you some of them. And if you need more help, you can click on the question mark, and you'll be taken to the online help page of that particular component. So I'm not on the wireless network at the moment, apparently, but it would take you to the Psychopy network, or the Psychopy website where you could see the components. So now we need to tell Psychopy what sound to play. So we have to choose a file name, which we would choose right here. So this would be a good time to set up the folder structure of our experiment. So let's create a folder on the desktop, and we'll call it lang experiment for language experiment. And then inside that folder, we can create a place to store the sounds that we'll be using in the experiment. And I typically like to keep things separated by file type. So usually I name the folders things like data, sounds, images, movies, stuff like that. This way it's easier for me to remember where to look if something isn't working correctly. So you can name things whatever you want as long as you remember where things are and you can tell Psychopy where to look. So I'm going to call the folder sounds. And then let's move all of the sounds from the Psychopy demo that I created for this, and those will be attached at the bottom of this post. Oops. Just go to the Finder. So let's move all of these into the sounds folder that we just created for our lang experiment folder. Okay, so I've labeled the one that we want to use for exposure, the sound that we want to use for our exposure. You can see it in here. I've labeled it exposure.wave. So let's tell Psychopy that we want our exposure audio routine to play exposure.wave. So notice that I typed sounds \exposure.wave or /. I did this because Psychopy can read two types of files. It can read absolute files, which is where you would specify the whole path. So this would be something like, for me, kschuler/desktop/lang experiment/sounds, etc. Or it can read a relative location. So whatever folder that this Psychopy experiment file is saved in, it counts that. It can look relatively from there to the next thing. So I've just specified here sounds because sounds is inside the lang experiment folder, which is where I'm going to save the experiment file. Okay. So I'm going to set the stop value here to 10 seconds for demonstration purposes. And that's just so we don't have to listen to the whole thing at the end because it's about 5 minutes long. But if you left the stop value empty, you'd be telling Psychopy to just play this file until it's over. So now I'm going to hit OK. And now you can see down here by the flow that there's nothing there, but there's a little black dot. So if you click on the black dot, that's just saying that's where you want to put it. And you'll see the exposure populate. So now we have an exposure routine in our flow that is 10 seconds long. So typically our experiments are set up so that we play the whole exposure. So here we don't need to repeat anything. Psychopy will just play our exposure audio until it stops, and then it will move on to the next routine in the flow. But if you wanted to set something up where you had one trial and you were reading from a list some sound files, you can do that as well. So before the exposure phase, we typically give subjects some sort of instruction. So to do this, we need to insert another routine, this time with a text component. So let's call this routine instructions. And again, you can see this little black dot show up. That's just so that you can tell Psychopy where you want to put this routine, and we want to put it before the exposure. So we'll set the instructions there. Now we can add a text component to the instructions. And you can see up here, all of your routines are up here. So we don't want to add it to the sound exposure. We want to add it to our instructions routine. And then we can go ahead and add a text component. So let's change the name now to something. So remember, every name that we generate has to be unique since we're creating variables for Psychopy to remember. And then we can change the stopping point to infinite again. So let's call this text instructions, and we'll change the stopping point to infinite again. Okay. And we're doing that because we want the subject to press a button when he or she is ready to move on. So we want the instructions to appear on the screen forever until the subject presses a button, which is another component that we'll add to this routine next. So now you just insert whatever text you want to appear down here where it says text. And I'm going to say, listen carefully to this language you have never heard before, and then press spacebar to begin. And then I'll hit OK. And these are all just default values where you could change some of the way it visually appears. I'm just going to leave them as a default for now because those are fine. So now we need to tell Psychopy to listen for the spacebar. So to do this, we have to add a keyboard response component to this routine, which will be down here, under responses, and the keyboard. So we can add a keyboard response. Because remember, it will go on forever. So here we can keep the name key response 2. Again, we want it to be infinite because we want Psychopy to listen for the key to be pressed until it's pressed. And then importantly, this force and routine button needs to be checked. So we want, as soon as this key is detected, we want it to be the spacebar, so we'll have allowed keys be space. So now, as soon as the spacebar is detected, this routine will end, and when this routine ends, it just moves on to the next one in our flow. So we'll say OK, and now we're done with our instructions portion. So now we have our instructions and our exposure, and all that's left is to collect our data in a test phase. So for this portion, we want to select another new routine, and let's call it test. For the test routine, we want the subject to hear a sound and then tell us whether they think that sound came from the language they just heard. So we'll add another sound component, which I'll name test sound. And let me just insert the routine here after exposure and make sure we're working on this routine. So we'll add another sound. We'll call this one test sound. And we'll make the duration infinite again. So we'll leave the rest of the values alone for now because we need to specify which test sound to play with the conditions file. So we won't worry about this quite yet. So to do that part, we want to insert a loop. So let's insert a loop. And now you can see this little black dot appears again. And so what we're trying to do is tell it where we want the loop to appear. And what we want to happen is it to loop around this test sound. So we're going to specify with the conditions file what sounds to play for the test. And Psychopy is going to go through a loop and just read each test item from the list and keep doing this portion over and over again. So we'll just say we want to start the loop here, from here to here, and we'll call this test loop. And now here I can specify whether the loop is random or sequential or some other options you can consider if you need them. I'm going to leave it at random for now. I'm also going to specify the number of reps that I want. So a lot of times for our studies, we just have one long file that specifies every single test item. And so if that were the case, I'd say 1, because I'd want it to go through the conditions file one time, because I worked really hard to make a very precise conditions file for the subject to participate in. But if I wanted to introduce some randomness, or if I had, say, 4 test items that I wanted to repeat, 5 times, that's where you can specify it here. So I'm going to say 3 times for right now. And then it says conditions file. And this is where we would input a conditions file we have for our experiment. So Psychopy can read 2 types of files. It can read xlsx and it can read .csv files. It can't read XLS files. That's important. If you use that format, Psychopy won't be able to tell what you're doing. So I'm going to use just a plain Excel xlsx file. It's just the newest format for Excel. And remember, we have 4 test sounds inside our experiment sound folder. And if you haven't looked at these yet, they're right here. We have this one, this one, this one, and this one. So let's create a parameter called sound. Actually, let's call it sounds. And now we have this parameter, and we want to tell Psychopy to play these sounds. So remember, Psychopy likes to know the relative path or the full path, so I'm going to do the relative path. It's inside the sounds folder. Oops, I was pointing at the screen as if you could see that sounds folder. And then I'll specify the file name. Okay. And then it's also nice to add some additional variables if you are going to want to know them for later data analysis. So for example, we're going to compare words and part words in this particular study. So I'm just going to create a variable called type, or a parameter called type, and then I'm going to label this as part word. And Psychopy will automatically add this to the data for us. And that way later we can just, we'll have automatically have coded what kind it is, and we won't have to do any like after the fact coding of our data. Okay, so I'm just going to add the rest of these files, and then we can keep going. And so I'm typing these really quickly. If Psychopy, once we're finished and we test this, throws an error, it's very likely that I'll have spelled a word wrong, and it'll tell me that it can't find that sound file. But if I spelled them all right, then everything will be fine. Okay, so now let's save this, and I'm just gonna, it's not really conditions, but you can call it anything you want, but I'm gonna call it conditions, and remember we're using this lange experiment folder, or whatever you named it while you're following along. Okay, so now we have the conditions file in our lange experiment folder, conditions.xlsx, and so then we can, as it's telling us, name of a file specifying the parameters for each condition. So we'll call this conditions.xlsx, and remember this is relative, so because I'm going to save the Psychopy file in this lange experiment folder, it will look in lange experiment for something called conditions, so we can just write it like that. Then we'll press OK, and now you see this little loop appears around the test. So whatever is in this test routine is going to be repeated however many times we specified, which was 3. Okay. So, and you can also, I forgot to mention, you can also see, so right now it's saying that no parameter set is found. So let's browse, and I'll try to load it from here. Usually that happens if it doesn't know where something is. So I haven't saved it yet, which means it couldn't find it. I haven't saved this untitled Psychopy experiment file. I haven't saved this to our folder, so it couldn't look at a relative location. It needs the full path, so that just filled in the full path for me. And now you see that it worked because it says 4 conditions, those are the 4 sounds we typed in, and then 2 parameters, sounds, which we typed in, and then type, which is something we added so we could mark our data. So we'll press OK. Okay, so now we have the sounds of our test set up, but remember we need to ask subjects to respond to this sound. So we have to add a text property, which will last until the end of the trial, or infinite. So we'll add another text component, and we'll call this text test. We want it to last forever, so we'll make that infinite, and then we'll say, did you hear this before? And this obviously isn't the technical way that we ask this. I'm just, for efficiency, writing things really quickly. And we'll press OK, so now we have that happening in this routine. And then the subject also needs a way to respond, and anytime you have infinite routines, this means this is going to keep going forever. So right now nothing would stop this. So we definitely need to add a response that's going to stop this from happening because we didn't set a time for it to stop. So this time we'll use a rating scale because we're going to ask the subject to rate on a scale from 1, which is the low end of the scale, to high, the 5, the high end of the scale, and you can set these at whatever you want. There's a whole bunch of different customizations you can make in the rating scale. So I gave them a scale from 1 to 5, and then I want to check to make sure, and this is going to also go on forever until the subject presses one of these things. Then I want to check just to make sure in the Advanced tab that forced end routine is checked because we're using this as an end point. And here it tells you how big it is and where it's located, so those are all things that you can play around with. And I also want store rating to be checked and store rating time. This would be a reaction time, and this will store the actual number that the subject selects. So we want to make sure those are checked as well so they get stored in our data file. Okay. Okay. So now we need to go back and tell Psychopy what sound to play. And we can refer to our sound file or our sounds variable in our conditions file by using the $sign. So we'll go into the test sound. Remember, we haven't told Psychopy what sound to play here. If we type a $sign, that tells Psychopy to look for a variable that was created. And the variable that we created, or the parameter we created, was called sounds. So we'll tell it to go and find the sounds variable, and then we'll tell it to set that every repeat, which means every time you go through this loop, pick a new sound file. So it's going to go through the whole conditions list. It's going to pick one off the list, then it's going to do the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and there are 4. And then remember, we had this loop repeat 3 times, which means we should have a total of 12 test items. Okay, so we'll hit OK. And then finally, we need another set of instructions before our test phase to let subjects know that the phase is going to start. And we can't just repeat this one. I'm sure you can copy and paste somehow, but you need to create another routine over here because we are having different instructions. So if I change the instructions on this next routine, it'll get messed up. So I think we might be able to add instructions here. And we want to do this outside of the loop because this will repeat every single time it goes through one thing on the conditions file, and we only want this to happen right after the exposure. Yeah, so we don't want this instructions because it has special text and it will change all of them to that text. Oops, cancel. We'll insert a new routine, call this test instructions. We'll insert that here. And so here we'll want to do the same thing that we did before. We want to insert some text. And I just named it that because text instructions is already taken by the routine we just inserted. That variable name is already taken. We want it to go on forever, and we want it to say, for the next part, listen and rate on a scale from 1 to 5. And you can, make that as formal as you need to. This is just for, showing purposes. And then we'll hit OK. And then we also want, oops, we forgot, I need to tell them to hit spacebar when ready. So hit spacebar when you're ready to go. Then we'll add another key response, and again for this one we want it to be spacebar. We want it to wait forever, and we want it to force the end of the routine again. So we'll hit OK. There. And then I actually like to always insert a thanks screen at the end of the study just to say thanks for doing this. So we'll add the thanks text and we'll say thanks, done. And this time we can just leave it on there for 2 seconds because we don't need them to press anything to acknowledge that they read it. We just want it to pop up for them. And I'll hit OK. And then hopefully this will work. So I just wanted to, that's the whole experiment. And so I just wanted to, before we move on, I just wanted to show you a couple of other things. First, we want to look at the experiment settings dialog box. That's this little blue box right here. So if you click on this, you can change some basic things like the name of the experiment. You can change some of the variables that show up, so you can add more that you would insert before the experiment begins. Enable escape is something that you really want to be checked. That means at any point in the experiment, like when you're testing or whatever, you can hit escape and it will quit immediately and save everything that's happened so far. Otherwise, you have to hit Control-Alt-Escape and it won't save everything that you've been doing. This will specify a path of the data. It usually uses the date and then some of the info like the subject ID that you typed in, but you can make it whatever you want. You can save an Excel file, you can save a trial-by-trial CSV. I usually save CSV because you can open that in Excel. And this is all just extra stuff. You can monkey around with the screen, but this will be loaded automatically. Psychopy calculates these values for you. The window size, color you can change. Right now it's going to be a shade of gray. We'll hit OK. And then another really useful tool is this paper and pencil, and this is something that Psychopy uses. It will basically generate the code. It says compile script. So it generates the Python code that will be used to run your experiment. So it's basically like you made all this stuff in the builder, and the code looks like this if you were to have just programmed it without the builder. So this is really nice if you just want to learn how it works, or if you need to add code snippets, like if you want to use eye tracking eventually, but you prefer this builder method. I can show you the codes that you need and where to insert them so that the eye tracking will happen and you'll get that data as well. Or if you just want to learn Python, this is a good way to do it because you built this whole experiment so you know exactly what's happening, and you can kind of read along to try to see what's going on in the experiment. Okay, so we'll close that. That's just to show you. We don't want to save that right this minute, so we'll save this one. We want to save it in our lang experiment folder because that's where all the relative paths are pointing. I'm going to call it do experiment. We'll save. And then we can go ahead and run it. So this green button runs, this red button stops. We're going to hit the green button to run. It wants us to type in our participant's name. We'll hit 12. And there's our text instructions. Listen carefully to this language you've never heard before. Space to begin. And you hear the exposure.wav file that we inserted. And now it says for the next part, listen and rate on a scale from 1 to 5. So we'll rate. We can rate all of them. Oops. And so this is exactly what I suspected might happen. So this is what happens when Psychopy throws an error. It'll tell you what line of the code it happened in, which is helpful if you're doing programming. But it also gives you some information about what is happening. It says could not find a sound named this, named plus value. So it couldn't find a sound named whatever you specified. And the way we specified the sounds was in the sound file. So if we look at our sounds, we can see the sounds folder we have. We have all these sounds, and it's looking for sounds, which is right. It's in the sounds folder. D-O-W, and I typed it K-E-Y, but here it's K-I-Y. So those two things had to match. And if they had matched, it would have gone through the whole experiment. But the only thing you missed was the thanks screen, so we won't go back and do it over again. Anyway, that's it. That's all of it. So Psychopy is a really, really great platform, I think, and hopefully you'll be able to use it for some of your experiments.